So you know where you want to be. Traveling to new places to use your new language, having whole conversations with your in-laws or your grandparents or friends, reading books in their original language, or just being able to walk down the street and talk to people who speak it. But how do you get there? How do you start learning a language from zero? In this video, I'll give you simple and practical steps to go from wanting to learn a language to actually doing it and get you on your way to fluency. And later on, I'll share with you the materials you're going to need based on your goals for language learning. Let's get started. A language can contain hundreds of thousands of words. And besides words, there's things like sentence structure and verb conjugation and pronunciation to contend with. And when you're starting out, you know none of this system. When this is the case, there are 3 necessary steps to take to start your language learning journey. First, you need to ask why you want to learn the language. Then, you should set specific and, when possible, quantifiable goals for your study. And finally, you need to gather all the materials you need for your learning. We'll go through these one by one, so you can feel confident starting to build fluency in your new language. First, why do you want to learn this language? It takes a ton of time to learn a new language, so your reasons for learning it matter, and that motivation will help you to choose a language to learn in the first place. There are over 7,000 languages in the world, each with different challenges and benefits associated with learning it. So the first question to ask yourself is, who do you want to talk to with this new language? Or what kind of information do you want access to when using it? Ultimately, what do you want to accomplish by learning and speaking this new language? We can break motivations to learn a language down into 3 categories. The first is necessity, like when you move to a new place where a different language is spoken, or if your job requires it. The second is practical use, like when your partner speaks a different native language, and maybe their family only speaks that language. This one sort of toes the line between necessary and practical. And the third type of motivator is pure interest. Maybe your lineage came through a country where a certain language was spoken, or you have a fascination with the language of the culture. Learning a language for travel reasons can fit in any of these 3 categories, depending on where you're going. Even if you don't need to learn a language for where you're traveling to, if you have the chance to, it can be so important to meet other people where they are, instead of expecting them to always meet you. On the other hand, you can often get by in English in many places of the world. Which of these, or which combination of these, you have for learning a language will likely affect which language you choose to learn. For example, Spanish is a language spoken in many countries of the world, many of which are popular travel destinations. And learning Spanish could help you unlock new experiences and navigate new spaces when you're traveling in those countries. On the other hand, the Uralic languages like Hungarian, Finnish, Sami, and Estonian are each spoken in smaller areas and by smaller populations. And you're likely to be able to get around just fine speaking English in many of these places. But these languages have incredibly interesting characteristics, like large noun case systems, kind of like verb conjugations, but for nouns, and vowel harmony, which requires vowels near each other to share certain features. These languages may be interesting simply as objects of study, aside from their practical use, which of course they also have. Whatever your reasons, one motivation that applies across languages is the feeling you get when you speak to a native speaker and they're pleasantly surprised and appreciative that you're speaking to them in the language they feel closest to. Now, within a language, there are always different ways of speaking it, and these different ways of speaking are often called dialects. Dialects are often tied to a region or a country. It's useful to choose a specific dialect if you can, because this will change concrete things about your language learning. Spanish provides a good example. Throughout Latin America, listeners can tell where someone is from based on how they make the sounds of the language. In Argentina, what is elsewhere j or y is sh, and in some varieties, especially in the Caribbean, s sounds are often deleted. In Spain, differences like this come at the level of region, or even city, and tie in with autonomous communities who speak and highly value languages other than Spanish. Choosing a dialect can often come down to where the speakers are that you want to connect with, or what dialects are spoken by people you already know, or perhaps what media you're interested in engaging with. For example, if you're interested in a language for reading and writing, you might want to learn literary ways of using it. In some cases, the literary really forms its own dialect, like in the case of Arabic, where modern standard Arabic is the written standard, but isn't the spoken standard in any part of the Arabic-speaking world. At least, not as a first language. It's a learned variety, used in spaces like academia and the media. The next question is what sorts of things you want to be able to do with the language. There are 4 core language skills: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And which of these you're most interested in will impact how you go about learning the language. I suggest always starting with learning the sounds, no matter what your goals are. Even if you're only wanting to learn a language to read with it, you'll read better and remember more if you know the sounds of the language. Learning to read in a language is popular with people who want to study old texts, like works of literature, philosophy, or science. And it's also useful if you want to read something in its original language, with all of its color and nuance. It also may be a good path if what you want is to understand the news that you read in newspapers or magazines from other countries. Or, in some cases, news that covers international events. There may be magazines that cover something like fashion that you're particularly interested in, and reading it in its original language would be a much richer experience. What specific things you want to read will become important later when we talk about what materials to gather. If, in addition to being able to read the language, you want to write it, you might be interested in finding a pen pal. Actually, do those exist anymore? Maybe you just want to make a friend online. Or you might want to write and publish your work in another language, online, or in a newspaper, or in book form. There's an author, Jhumpa Lahiri, who wrote only in English for a long time, but in recent years has adopted Italian as a medium for her fiction. I've put a link in the description to her book about it, Translating Myself and Others. Or maybe you're in a degree program, and you need to not only read in a given language, but write in that language as well. Writing, in addition to reading, will require you to know things at a deeper level, like the exact guidelines around when words and pieces of words combine with each other, and how. You might be interested in listening in particular, if you want to consume music or podcasts in another language. And then there are many good reasons to learn how to speak another language as well. This could allow you to do things like take a job in another country, or improve your communication at work if there are multiple languages represented. You can meet new people for a variety of reasons, or you can even learn to speak to help out in your community. Whether that's through more official work, like volunteering as an interpreter or a translator, or unofficially, where you might be able to help people around you communicate with one another when they normally have difficulties. And whichever or however many of these core language skills you're going to be paying attention to, you're going to learn the others to some extent. This is important and helpful because each skill supports every other skill. You can see how useful it is to picture a word in written form in order to remember how it's said and to be able to hear a word as you read it. But if you're wanting to work on all four from the beginning as your focus, this is probably the most common way to go about learning a language. And if you study all four, you'll start to find that you're more flexible with the use of your new language. Now, from the very beginning, we're going to add structure to your language learning. Once you've determined what language you want to learn and why, it's time to set specific objectives for your learning. So far, you have this larger thing you want to do, which is learn the language. Maybe that's learn to read, write, speak, listen, 2 of these, 3 of these, all 4 of them, and we'll call this your goal. But this needs to be made more concrete by recognizing exactly what it is you want to be able to do with your language in order to one day consider that your goal has been accomplished. Of course, like with anything, learning a language is never complete, but it's helpful to determine what it means to you to be able to speak the language, or what it means to know the language if you're not learning to speak it, and how you might recognize that you've done that. And to figure out what this looks like for you, it's best to use specific numbers to define capabilities you want to have. This is easiest to do in terms of number of words you know. But even here, we'll see that it's kind of difficult to put numbers to how well you speak a language. There are several ways to measure your level of proficiency with a language. First is official tests. These might be where you want to turn if you want to gain certification in your target language. They aren't free, but they do provide a fairly comprehensive view of how well you're doing. You might decide the price is worth it, but do your research, because there are many such tests out there, and they differ in their goals and their methods. Another option is graded readers. These are texts which sometimes use a specific number of words, say 1,000, or they can be graded by proficiency level on some well-known exam. Either way, these readers can help you track your progress by evaluating yourself for how much of the reader you understand when you read it. A more do-it-yourself approach is to use frequency lists. These will give you the 100 or 1,000 or 3,000 most common words in the language, and can often be found online. But rather than study the list, go about your learning as you normally would with the other materials you're using. Then every few months perhaps, go through the list to see how much of it you know. At first, you might start with the top 100 words and see how many of them you know. Then, once you're confident in those 100, progress to the 500 word list, and then to the 1,000 word list, and so on. This way, you can check yourself periodically as you go. Finally, you can use estimations of words you need to know in order to be at a certain level of language proficiency. These estimations are less precise, but can be helpful in a general way. For example, you can find estimates of how many words you would need to know for certain things. For holding daily conversations, some rough numbers you'll find are you need to know 2,000 or 3,000 words. To read a novel or sound like a native speaker, more may be required, on the order of 8,000 words. But these numbers vary widely, depending on who you ask and how they're measuring, so use this approach lightly. And there are also ways of assessing yourself that don't include numbers, like how easy it feels to keep up a conversation with someone in your target language, or how often you have to stop when you're reading in order to look up words, or how much of a podcast you understand. These are valuable because they speak to the actual experience you have with the language, which is related to the numbers but goes beyond them. So set yourself objectives in terms of numbers if you can, usually numbers of words or a score on a test, and use looser measures too, and then plan to assess yourself periodically. This will help by making the idea of learning a language a real, concrete thing you can achieve, broken down into smaller steps that you can keep track of along the way. Using a mix of motivations and objectives will help you as you learn toward your ultimate goal. There will be days that you don't feel like it, or days when you feel like you're not moving forward, or you're too busy. But knowing why you're doing it and keeping in mind specific objectives will help you during those times. With your motivations and objectives in place, you've got to gather your materials and set yourself a schedule. Let's start with the materials. The materials you use are going to depend on what skills you want to develop. But no matter what you want to be able to do with a language, I suggest having 3 things available to you. The first is a description and explanation of the sounds of your language. This can often be found online. Wikipedia has pages dedicated to the phonology of different languages. Phonology meaning the set of sounds available in that language and the way they're organized. And there are also offline resources for language sounds. Like, if you're interested in getting a little deeper, Linguistic Introductions to Languages, published by companies like Routledge and Cambridge University Press. To support this, you can also find native speakers in places like YouTube who are talking about the sounds of their languages. But this isn't a substitute for understanding the sound system of your target language in a detailed way. To really understand the sounds of your language, the gold standard is the International Phonetic Alphabet, which I'll link to a video about here and in the description once I've posted it. This is a system that makes it possible to know and compare all the sounds of all the different languages in the world, giving you the ability to build off what you know from your native language and nail the sounds in your new one. The second thing you should have is a word frequency list for your language. We talked about this earlier, and just starting, you don't need a very long list. The top 100 words will do. These are the words that you should spend extra time learning at first. And the third thing every language learner should have is a solid textbook for their target language. A textbook is designed to help the learner understand how the language works and also give some appropriate practice for beginners. Both aspects are crucial to language learning, and a textbook provides them. But you do need to go beyond the textbook to get real-world input for your learning. And determining which other materials are more or less necessary will depend on what skills you want to develop. For those interested in reading, consider picking up level-appropriate reading material. As I mentioned before, consider finding other material too, the stuff that you're most interested in reading. At this point, those things might be a little complex for you, but by getting into them, you're providing that extra motivation to learn the language, and you're likely to pick up vocabulary that matters to you. If you're working toward writing, make sure you have a detailed breakdown of the writing system for the language you're learning. This might be included as part of your textbook, but you also might want something more in depth, especially if the writing system is very different from what you're used to. Often, you'll find that writing systems, just like writing in English, have particular orders for how marks should be made on the page. An example is Devanagari, a writing system used for languages like Hindi and Sanskrit. These languages are best written by making all the other marks first, and then the line along the top. And if you're listening and speaking, this is where you'll find other types of material more helpful. A great way to start training your ear is to start listening to videos on YouTube in your target language, though this will have limited benefits at first. But there are other, more learner-friendly ways to start hearing the language and understanding it, such as the classic Pimsleur system, where you start off hearing and repeating simple words and phrases, and progress from there. These are usually available from libraries, though I've included a link in the description if you want to buy the system. And if you happen to know someone who speaks the language, it can be helpful, even early on, to start trying conversations with them. These conversations will be with people who are willing to engage in simple interactions, and understand that you're not going to be perfect on day or month 1, and who have the patience to speak to you. If you don't have anyone around you like this, maybe it's best to hold off for now, but it won't be long before you're seeking out conversation partners. With these considerations in mind, it can be helpful to decide what your main tool is going to be for learning your language. And a good candidate for this is the textbook you're going to use, especially if you're studying all 4 language skills. Textbooks often give very good introductions to all areas of languages, so this is a good central resource you can use, and then branch out from as you go. And once you have this central tool, and the other materials you're going to want to use, it's time to set a schedule. When it comes to a schedule, it's going to depend mostly on how much time you have to give to learning in a given week. If you have only a little time, you might focus on moving slowly through the textbook, and then spending the rest of the time focusing on your secondary resource that you've chosen. If you have a decent amount of time, you might plan to move at a faster clip with these 2 resources, the primary and the secondary. Or you might add a third resource that you're using on a regular basis. However much time you have, spend some of it during the first month or 2 focusing on the sounds, in addition to whatever other things you're doing. Here's how you might go about learning if you have a moderate amount of time to give each week. For each 7-day period, set out 3 sessions where you work through the textbook, and aim to complete a chapter a week, depending, of course, on the size of the chapters in your textbook. In addition to this, set 2 sessions to work on the sounds, the 100 most common words, the writing system, or, as you get further along, speaking and listening practice. Each week, the extra thing you're working on besides the textbook can change, but the textbook sessions stay the same. This helps you to build a strong core based on linguistic principles from the textbook, but add to these with more practical experience and self-directed study, making it more engaging because you're learning things that you're particularly interested in. After taking these steps to lay the foundation for learning a new language, you're ready to get started. And as I've mentioned, the best place to start is with the sounds. I'll be making a video about that soon, and when I do, it'll be right here and in the description below. Leave any questions or comments you have about the material we've covered in this video below. Like and subscribe for more content like this, and we'll see you in the next one.